I'm not sure how often as enablement professionals we pause to really think about if there were a business or an enablement hall of fame, what would we want our nameplate to say? And I'm curious to know how many of you all really feel like you have a crystal clear version of your personal brand statement, your personal brand statement. I basically run enablement as a business within a business. That's a very, very clear statement. It might not be what you want your brand to be, but it's a great statement. I thought that was very powerful. So that kind of clarity, I think, brings a lot to ourselves and our team. A brand is a living entity. And actually, I've talked a lot about this today with people in change and how we need to always be refreshing. So this concept of living entity is really, I think, really important for us to think about. And it's also cumulative, right? So we might start in our careers in one place, and we may add to that over time, depending on not only our own personal experience, but also what we're seeing from our companies and our company cultures. So this idea of living entity and cumulative, there's a theme that's kind of gonna emerge from this as we go through this. My brand story started pre-tech, so curious to know also in the audience, how many people in the audience are accidental enablement professionals? I know I am. Yeah, so some very intentional folks as well, but I had a whole life before tech, and let's just say my brand was about being a free spirit and about being very creative, because it was not about being in tech, it was not about being somebody who helped enable organizations. I was a journalism marketing major. I wanted to kind of go out and do some interesting things with my life. I did work for Disney for a brief period of time in their music publishing department. I was unemployed for a period of time, obviously, had a whole series of things. And I really had this idea that I was not going to be in the corporate world at all. So when my opportunity in tech came knocking, that was my brand. That's what I had. But I got my first opportunity with Macromedia, and I came in and I did not start in enablement. I started with localization and internationalization. How many of you think that I had any experience whatsoever in localization and internationalization? I did not. But I did use that creativity, that creative part of my brand, because there were two things that I did have. I had the ability to actually talk to different types of people, figure out how to connect them, and then also creatively solve problems in some complex situations. And that served me well. And in a startup type environment, it also gave me many more opportunities, which I went from being the creative person who could kind of help translate between the engineers and the marketing teams and so forth, to the person who was going to start up the next thing, which is international marketing, and I did the websites. But eventually, because I was working with so many of our field offices, ended up in sales enablement, because they were primarily sales focused. Some of the ability I had for working with international markets and that kind of translator type thing served me well and put me into this position to be more than just the average enablement professional. But I think a lot of my opportunities came because I was doing something a little bit more, or I approached it a little bit differently than your average enablement person. So at Macromedia, what that meant was I worked a lot with our integration teams, getting teams up and running. In fact, that's how I made my way to Adobe, because I was in the lead office for the integration between when Adobe acquired Macromedia. I spent 7 months there with that being part of my brand. Once I was at Adobe, my first job was in enablement, was in partner enablement and programs. And once again, I had sort of continued those elements came with me. But Adobe was experiencing a huge amount of change, right? And so when I was in my partner enablement role, there was a sales enablement position that opened up. There was no enterprise sales force whatsoever. And I got the call. Now, I think that's a lot of it. I had done sales enablement, but I also had these other attributes, right? So took that on. And once again, I think that's when I had the moment where I realized I was in an environment where I really needed to kind of develop the kind of persona of, it's a little bit of a Star Trek persona, right? Boldly go where no man has gone before. And because most of it there was nothing. Like, how do you transform a company like that into this new piece? So I certainly tried to get as much as I could from people around me, but the willingness to jump in and be that kind of person, the first person, right? Again, the first person to go boldly with where no one has gone before, was an asset, because a lot of people don't want to change, right? When you're in those environments, they kind of like their gig and they're happy with it, and changing is hard. So once again, I did a lot of my work and the homework to be a good enablement professional, but I actually put a lot of emphasis on that part of being willing to change and understanding the direction the company was going, because that was hard for people to get their heads around, I think. So there's nothing quite as powerful as making you want to pause as when you decide you need to make a change. And so I had a couple of pretty good runs between Macromedia and Adobe. I was comfortable, it was good. It was good stuff, right? The company was doing well. I felt like we were making a big impact. But I started to reflect. And at that moment, I really had to think about, okay, how do I translate this into my external brand? Because I wasn't looking, I was happy, I was very challenged. I had numerous, I had good sponsorship, all those things. That moment was very telling for me, because then you have to look at not only your experience within the company, but how do I tell that story to someone outside of the company? And what am I looking for in terms of a brand match, right? Because it's not just about your brand, but does your brand match the brand of the company you're going to? So I paused and thought about it, because there's tons of people in this room that probably has more experience or better ideas than I do, just on the surface, right? And in a real sense. So what is the unique thing that I have? And what I realized is I had been part of this very interesting transformational change, right? Where the company had, when I started with Adobe, $2 billion. When I left, $7 billion. Box software company, cloud company. So really what I realized was I am a transformational leader, right? Who also can help mobilize a workforce. And that was really the conversation I was trying to have when I was going out and looking at companies and when companies were looking at me, which was what was so exciting when I found Splunk, because they're a $1 billion company, right? Growing like crazy. And the culture was the type of culture that was ready for exactly, they're looking for someone who can drive not just an enablement program, but a change. And that's really, I think, where I connected in most of my conversations with everyone, and that's where I really feel like we found our match, was because I had spent that time to kind of go through that discovery myself. So it was very interesting and very powerful for me to not only go through that myself, but also think about how I could start to talk about this with others in the profession. Because, like I said, normally I talk about enablement topics. I don't talk about brand, but it's important for us. It's important for our teams. But let's kind of step back a little bit. That's my story. And think about this from maybe two other angles. One is, what does a great brand stand for in general? I mean, these companies have been fighting it out on the Forbes list for quite some time for the first place. And probably if I asked you all, you could have a really great brand statement around each of these, right? Certainly think differently, what have you. But these are pretty lofty, and since I'm such a brand expert, I thought, well, I'm going to go out to my brand network and talk to some people about, maybe some companies that are a little bit smaller that maybe I can put out as an example. So my brand network is not quite as good as my enablement network, so I ended up talking to my 14-year-old daughter. And my 14-year-old, if any of you who has a teenager, they think they know a lot about a lot of topics, so this was a good place for me to go. But I asked her, I said, tell me some brands that you like. What are some good brands? What resonates for you? And she said, listen, I got to tell you, first of all, I just expect quality in my brands, Mom. I was like, okay, fine, whatever, that's great. And then I said, great, and she said, well, but value is a really important thing to me. Now, she has a very limited budget because I know exactly what her budget is. So value is really, really important to me. And the other thing that's really important to me is ethics. Honestly, this is our conversation in the car going back and forth on the weekend. Like, okay, well, those are actually pretty good things, actually. I expect quality. I want ethics in my company, and I want value. I need to know that I'm getting the value for my dollar. So I said, okay, well, just give me a name. She was throwing out a lot of makeup companies and things like that. And she landed on Urban Outfitters. So I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. And I said, so tell me what that means. And she threw out a lot of these names. It's a lifestyle company. They're creative. They really understand the culture. She's kind of got all that stuff. She thinks she's being all cool. Well, then I go online and I kind of look it up. And I'm like, what's really cool about this as an example for us is that Urban Outfitters actually has a comeback story. So they had their brand. They understood their brand. They were being successful. And then I think it was about in 2000, I'm going to get the date wrong, but they had a just everything kind of screeched to a halt, and their investors were not happy, things were not going well. And what they realized is they were disconnected from the people who actually, their customers, right? They were disconnected. So they went back to their roots, really focusing on the right audience, and suddenly everything started to progress. So just kind of putting a little spin on that from an enablement perspective and this kind of constant change thing. How many times have you all been in a position where you've realized that you're disconnected from your audience? Maybe everything's been going great, and then suddenly, screeched to a halt. I guess what I was, thought I was kind of, the value I was bringing maybe was not quite what it was. And so this idea of going back to your customers repeatedly, your stakeholders, really making sure you're aligned, because the brand has to, going back to the brand match has to be there, both internally and externally. I had a couple of really big moments, aha moments around that myself. I remember a very specific meeting because, at Adobe, when I was going through a lot of, the company was bringing in a ton of new people. That just, happens when you have that. And I went to a meeting. I knew the leader that I was working for. He knew my brand. He knew what I stood for. So I was like, I'm good. I've got this. Go and do my usual thing. And I'm looking around the room, and I can tell that not even one of those people are in there with me. Not even one. None of my peers. Every single one of them was new. And I was like, oh, this is not good, right? But my brand meant nothing to them. They didn't know me. They didn't have the history with me. I had not honestly taken the time to kind of back up a little bit and make sure that the brand match was there, that what I was offering, the value that I could uniquely provide was even anything that they cared about. And it was a really big moment for me because not only was that not a place that I was used to being, but it wasn't good for my team either. It was a bad thing for my team that I was standing up in front of that room like that. So this idea of revisiting and really go back and reinvestigate your brand and really make sure, particularly if you're in an environment that is fast moving, that you're not missing it. Because just because you have a great brand with everybody else, that one new person doesn't know you. So that was pretty powerful. So thanks to Izzy for my Urban Outfitters example. She was helpful. So now I want to take this to a personal brand. Just talk about this from the angle of who are out there, which people are out there that are really doing an amazing job from a personal brand statement perspective. So last week was the Splunk Sales Kickoff in Vegas, and Diana Nyad came to speak. So for those of you who don't know who she is, she was a swimmer in the 70s. She retired from swimming when she was 30, and she always had this dream, this really goal, to swim from Cuba to Florida. But she quit, and then at 60, she went back in, and was going to make that swim. And she failed repeatedly. You go watch her TED Talk, you'll get snippets of this, but she failed repeatedly. She had, literally life-threatening situations. She was bitten by jellyfish. This swim is treacherous, right? There's sharks, the currents are crazy, all kinds of stuff. They're literally feeding her like a dolphin as she's swimming because she can't touch the boat, right? It's crazy stuff. But she actually was the first person against all odds to go out and make the swim from Cuba to Florida. And when there's a clip they show, they show these really powerful clips, right? When she's walking up after just tons and tons of many years and all this stuff, she walks up on the beach, and she's bloated, she can barely speak, her throat's all swollen, and she says two things that are very clear. First thing she says is, never give up. So it comes out, and everything she speaks about, that's what she's about. Never give up. And the second thing she says is, you can find a way, you're never too old, you're never too old. And that's all she said. It was very clear. She didn't need to say anything else. If you hear her speak, there's no question that that's coming from this is coming from a foundation of belief and conviction. That's just who she is. Because you can't do something like that. She calls herself a fanatic, and she's definitely 12 to 14-hour practice days of swimming. That's fanatical, but she never gave up. And so what I like about that as an example is it's just, I was totally blown away and inspired by her ability to speak and tell stories, and she sings, and she's just amazing. But it's very, very clear. And if you can, if you think about it, if you can kind of do that in your moment of, when you're not 100% on your toes, then you're very clear on your own brand. Those are some different angles and different ways to think of a brand, but let's think about this from an enablement perspective. And I talked a little bit initially about how do we, particularly with the industry has changed so much in the last however many years, right? It's changed. What we need to do, what got us here won't get us there, I think someone said earlier. But how do we differentiate within our organizations, and why do we even care? So if you look at all three of those stories, there are some common themes, definitely, about being authentic, about needing to have sort of something simple to deliver and so forth. I think, does it come from a place of belief and conviction? Is it really who you are and what makes you tick? And what do you believe what you're putting out there? And does it inspire? But at the end of the day, what's going to make it, I keep hearing this term, right? Claim your seat at the table. And I think pausing long enough to do this, it sounds very self-serving. But what I really, in my moment of truth, when I was not at my best brand, what I realized is that the brand that we have is the halo that we put over our entire organization. So if we don't start with a strong brand and we don't encourage our teams to sort of live that, then they're going to have a harder time selling everything. We're talking about how do we get buy-in? How do I make the business case? How am I going to change this culture? How am I going to get people to follow me? And you do that by inspiring, and you do that by being very clear on the value that you provide to the organization. This is essential for us and for our teams as we look to sort of transform the view of where enablement should be seated. I mean, we should be a strategic partner to the business. That is where we should be sitting. And anybody who's in this room who is struggling to get there, I think we're all have been there, but that's where we deserve and should be seated in order to be effective. So this is where I really believe this is the brand, and just the exercise of going through this brand statement really helps us maybe flip the lens a little bit and think about it from how do I find the match between what I stand for, what I want my team to do, and the change we want to drive, and how do I frame that in a way that's going to resonate with the people who are responding to my brand? I like two concepts that I really want to embrace as I kind of think about my go-forward brand statement. One is a lot of what got me here on that timeline, and this is see the forest and the trees. So this idea of being able to see the bigger picture, connecting to the business, but still being able to kind of function at multiple levels across the organization. That's something that I think has benefited me as I've gone along, and I want to continue with that as part of my brand. But the other thing is I'm very fortunate because the company is very open to this concept of continual improvement. And so I think for us to get better, for me personally to get better, for our sales teams or our field teams to get better, for anyone to get better, we have to be able to recognize that we all have some kind of weakness. None of us are perfect. Our teams aren't perfect. We're not perfect. So how do we just recognize that and get ahead of it? And having that, I think someone used the word, proactive is a word that comes up a lot, but as opposed to be the intake engine, which enablement often is, right? And I can see this already with my team. They're monster producers. They can just, wow, the volume is incredible. And usually people who are in this profession, they're just not slackers. They're okay being behind the scenes, right? They're good at what they do. But they're definitely, I want to kind of change the perception, which is we've got this continual improvement. We need to really be aligned to bigger vision, and we need to kind of be proactive versus just the intake engine. And that's how I think ultimately we will earn our seat at the table, because I have to earn my seat at the table at Splunk. I'm new. So far, so good. 5 weeks in, everybody's like, hey, we're so glad you're here. Now it's like, oh, I got to do something now that I'm here, right? So let's kind of maybe take this home a little bit around some key takeaways. I love the idea of a living entity. It just means it's something we look at constantly. And keep your brand fed and growing. Don't do what I did. Don't forget to reinvestigate. Really, really important, particularly with the fast-paced the business these days. Know yourself. Be true to that. Know your customer. It's a brand match. So really consider that as you're looking to form it. And then, it has to come from authenticity. So build it from where you're passionate, where you believe your value add, what you think is uniquely yours. And then make sure you're clear on your unique value in that proposition. And if you do that, that's going to set the tone for your whole team. It's going to challenge them to set their own brand, make their own brand statements. And it will make it much easier for them to transition into this different way of thinking, which is I should be at that table. And by gosh, you need me as a strategic partner. When I look at this, I would just say today, maybe tomorrow, when you're driving in the car, whenever your moment is, take a moment to really think about what your brand statement is if you haven't already. What is your mission? What is your personal brand statement? And do it from a point of uniqueness. So what are you good at? What's the value you want to bring? And how does that match to my audience? And I think if we do that as enablement professionals, not only can we deliver great enablement experiences, but we'll deliver great business impact as well.